What do you think it would feel like to lose your soul? Would it feel like nothing at all? Just like a sudden emptiness inside of you, a void or vacuum where you know that something important once was and now simply isn't? Maybe it would be cold, like a spear of ice through the chest, or like icy wind finding its way inside you and freezing everything it touches. Or maybe it would be hot. Hot like a red-hot poker. Like a purifying fire melting away everything that made you, you, and leaving nothing but ash, smoke, and metal. I'm very happy to say that I don't know the answer to that question. Or rather, I'm happy to say that I can't answer it from personal experience at least. But if you were to ask a Necron that very same question, if you were to find one of the rare few with both an amiable disposition and enough of their faculties intact to cast their mind back some 60 million years, they might think that they remember enough to tell you that it was the last option, for they may remember the fires of roaring forges and the laughter of feasting gods. But they would be wrong. I am talking, of course, of biotransference, the dark and eldritch process by which the ancient warlike and mercurial Necron tier, a species plagued by sickness and infighting, were remade. Melted down and reforged in living metal, their flesh disintegrated and their souls scooped out like marrow from a bone, all under the patient and encouraging gaze of the Catan, the gods of Void and Star, who were kind enough and generous enough to gift the Necron tier with the knowledge to build the machines required to undergo the nightmarish process. Biotransference was sold to the Necron tier as salvation, as ascension, as the great gift of benevolent gods to a dying, desperate people at war with selfish beings who refused to share the secrets of immortality, and the Necron tier, who by many accounts were desperate and proud and had run out of other options, believed it, or otherwise were forced to go along with it. And this is quite an interesting point, because of what little we know about Necron tier society, what has not been lost, corrupted, or otherwise manipulated over millions of years of war, supernatural interference, calamity, and decay, we know as much as we can know anything about their society that biotransference was not something universally accepted and embraced among their kind. In Indomitus, Zozar the Destroyer shows us his dreamlike memories of the day of biotransference. All was quiet now. The rioters had no more strength. The rebels had been cowed. The disenfranchised infected no longer possessed the strength for upheaval. Rioters, rebels, the disenfranchised infected, upheaval. This tells us a lot. This is not the language of a civilization marching willingly and determined into a glorious new age on their path to victory and vengeance. You do not cow rebels in a society that has reached consensus on a matter. You cow them in one that clearly has not. Evidently, there were riots. There was organized resistance against biotransference. There were rebels drawn from the disenfranchised masses who fought against Necron tier rulers determined to drag them into an unwanted future, and they, quite clearly, lost. The point is echoed again in The Infinite and the Divine, in which both Trazyn and Orican each dubiously recall versions of events in the lead up to biotransference that suggest some, maybe many, Necron tier were forced into the process against their will. Though the deceiver is hinted at distorting their recollections, each remembers feeling metal hands locked around his wiry arms of flesh, his feet kicking and shoulders dislocating as the relentless androids dragged him towards the emerald fires of the forge, towards the spiritual sundering of biotransference. And even Warcom touches upon the same series of events, whether they went willingly or were forcibly rounded up by prowling ghost arcs, the Necron tier were transformed utterly. Taken together, these accounts paint a picture of division, of resistance and societal upheaval, For many Necrontyr, biotransference was something forced upon them, clearly with force and violence, but also undoubtedly deceit and trickery. So biotransference was very much a hot and controversial topic at the time, quite understandably. But what exactly did the process of biotransference involve? The more observant among you may have picked up the quick description showing itself in that Infinite and the Divine quote, "Emerald fires of the forge." So green fire was involved apparently, and a forge too. Many will have heard of or seen references to such things in this context of great machines and biotransference halls that the ancient Necrontyr, as we have established, seldom entered of their own accord. But what did the process look like? How does a sentient organism, a people of flesh and blood and bone and soul, become a cold, soulless shell of deathless metal? What actually happened inside the machines? What did it feel like? Well, Zozar's dreams from Indomitus help us out again in answering these questions. The contraptions, the instruments or mechanisms that facilitated the process of biotransference were indeed called great machines. They were built by the hands of the finest cryptex with the infinite knowledge of the Catan and had angled walls and projecting antennae, stretching like hands towards the rising sun. In the case of Zozar's recollection, the particular great machine that brought about his own transformation was sat atop a great mountain overlooking a great city of pyramid-like buildings. It was gated and had a long marble path leading up the slope of the mountain called Evermount and up to the halls of the great machine. Yet the process of biotransference does not appear to have operated quite as you might imagine. There is little indication of any clear threshold, any glowing emerald portal or doorway through which the tumor-ridden Necrontyr entered one side and left from the other as immortal Necrons. Zozar's account instead suggests something a bit weirder, whereby the great machines, the biofurnaces, seem to have radiated their influence over the area that surrounded them, transforming those who approached them long before they reached the machine itself. As he recalls, Zozar took his daughter's hands and led them up the marbled pathway, while other families gathered ahead at the gates. He was torn from his reverie by a strange sensation, like grit in his hands. He rubbed his fingers together, realizing he no longer held on to his children. It felt like sand falling from his palms. Zozar looked down at his daughters. Each was falling apart, slowly disintegrating into dull, ruddy crystals. Flesh became dust, slipping away from a shining metal skeleton beneath. He looked at his own hands, the gnarled, cancer-ridden digits falling on the breeze too. The sensation crept up his arm, freezing for a moment, leaving a chilled numbness in its wake. His wife gasped in horror. He turned his eyes upon his beloved, but she looked back not with the eyes of love and warmth, but the cold red stare of optical lenses. All three had become animated statues, embodiments of death that he had labored hard to escape. The great machine was meant to free them from the burdens of the flesh, but not like this. So either Zozar was so deeply lost in his thoughts and his reverie that he had effectively zoned out as he entered the forge, or the great machines do simply give off an aura that causes the transformation to take place even from a distance. Either way, this is a great description of the process and the awful changes that took place. It does seem painless for the most part though. A freezing, creeping numbness as your flesh falls away on the breeze as dust. It could be worse, I guess, given previous understandings, but there was also a mental jolt experienced at the exact moment of transformation. Zozar doesn't comment on it, though the Overlord Simut does in the same book. Simut felt a mental jolt, so that for an impossible moment it seemed as though the entire universe stood still. It seemed the very same sensation that had come to him at the moment of biotransference, when his consciousness had been transposed into its artificial body. All of creation had held its breath for that instant. The moment of change, the moment the Necron tier stopped being Necron tier. This moment was marked by a timeless mental jolt the instant your body was disintegrated, your soul torn away, and your consciousness tied to a cold shell of living metal. Yet to any onlooker, to the waiting family still climbing up the marble pathways, to the crowds gathered at the gates, and to the masses of the disenfranchised being driven towards their fate, there was something quite more concerning than all of this unfolding overhead. For as on the day of biotransference, the C'tan themselves had drifted, vast and tattered through the ash plumes of the immolated Necron tier. And that is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. The cherry on top of all this numbing horror is the fact that the very gods who had gifted the Necron tier the knowledge of biotransference, who had promised freedom from the curse of flesh and victory over an ancient enemy, the Old Ones, were very much present to witness the fulfillment of that promise. More than this, they drifted like vultures over a battlefield because this was indeed a feast for them. As billions, forced or hopeful, marched into the supposed emerald fires of the great machines, the star gods engorged themselves. Every soul freed from its mortal vessel was consumed greedily by the very same entities that had orchestrated the entire deception from the beginning. And this leads us to the question of what biotransference actually cost. The loss of one's physical form is obvious enough. Flesh, blood, and bone fell away and was replaced with necrodermis. The loss of the soul was an even steeper price, torn from the body and devoured by the C'tan as they drifted above the forges. But for many Necron tier, the truest loss was the loss of self. We know that the nobility were among the first to enter the forges, and we know that these privileged elites retained much of their sentience and independent thought after the process, though with some significant caveats. The vast majority of the population received no such consideration. The common citizenry were robbed of any individuality or feeling, reduced to little more than, well, robots. The warrior castes fared only slightly better, holding on to just enough awareness and autonomy to execute orders effectively and wage war on behalf of their betters. But even those lucky enough to preserve their consciousness paid yet another terrible price. The process of biotransference, the blighted gift that had moved their consciousness to deathless metal bodies, had also burned away nearly all artistry. The Necron tier were not just tyrants, warriors, scientists, and engineers. They were artists, poets, sculptors, musicians. They had deep culture as well as advanced technology, creativity as well as jealousy and ambition, and that part of them was largely destroyed. Of the relatively small number who held onto their minds after biotransference, many discovered that they no longer could create as they once had. The spark that had once driven the artistic expression of the species had been lost alongside so much else. As Necrons, they forged rather than created. Biotransference was definitely then a nightmarish thing. And yet, to go back and answer the question I posed at the beginning of this video, the loss of one's soul does not appear to have been accompanied by some unimaginable pain, be it hot or cold. From what I can piece together, biotransference seems to have felt like a strange and disorienting process. A cold, creeping numbness spreading through the body as flesh fell away as dust, followed by a timeless mental jolt at the instant the transformation finished. Pain, then, was not the true horror of biotransference. The true horror was in everything else, in everything that was lost. Body, soul, freedom, individuality, creativity, and imagination, for most Necron tier, even their consciousness. To quote our strange friend Trazyn, in the end, no one deserves what happened during biotransference. No one. The Necrontyr leapt off a cliff on the promise that they had wings, and they were deceived. Anyway, thanks for watching. Dystopian Chimp, out.